thanks for everybody that's attending here in person at the Douglasville Seventh-day Adventist Church, and we want to acknowledge all those that may be attending at home or via streaming services. Thank you for participating with us. Let's bow our heads for prayer this morning. Dear Jesus, thank you for your word. Thank you for the Sabbath school lesson that helps us dig into your word and learn certain aspects of it that we wouldn't learn without somebody else's perspective. Thank you for the ability to gather together and hear additional other perspectives from our church family. Help us to put you first in our lives. Help us to learn and to apply what we learn to our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so our lesson today is on worship and worship in education. Our memory verse is, "Give to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come before him. O worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness." And this is from 1 Chronicles 16:29. And we'll get to that broader passage in just a little bit, but something is due God, and it's give to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering. Is an offering something that's free, or does it cost us?
It really ought to not be considered either, because if you're giving it out of your heart, you're not really calculating the cost.
Sure, not calculating the cost, but there is some, we're going to see that there is some cost to worship. If we're giving true worship, there is a cost associated on our side. Christ paid the ultimate cost by giving his life, and that's why he is due our worship. But
isn't the cost it only apply if you have less benefit than you're getting from the cost? And in this, we get a greater benefit than the cost ever could be.
Sure.
In several ways. Of course, once through his gifts of salvation, but the other, he opens the windows of heaven.
Absolutely.
To those, one way or another. Some may benefit financially, others may benefit emotionally, whatever.
Sure.
There is an absolute benefit
Agreed.
to his kingdom.
But there is an initial down payment that we have to be willing to pay. And
it's a stepping out in faith.
It is.
We just like when the Israelites were carrying the ark, they had to put their foot in the river before the waters parted.
Right.
That water was deep, I understand.
May have been deep, may have been cold, may have been muddy. There was something intangible, or
there was a potential risk.
There was a risk or a cost to that.
And in reality, it's a potential risk.
Right.
Because it's not a risk when he acts. It's only a potential risk.
Agreed.
When I step forward, and if I step forward in presumption, then the risk is real.
Right.
If I step forward in faith, there is no risk.
But this is back to our memory text. We're going to give to the Lord the glory due his name, so he's due some glory. And I think that any true worship has a cost associated with it. Now, we may get way more benefit from him if we pay that small down payment, but there is a cost. And we want to come before him. Oh, worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. So what's our definition of holiness? When I say holiness, what does it make you think of?
Without imperfection, in a way.
Say that again.
Perfect without imperfection.
Perfect without imperfection. So I lead a team at the hospital, and we're in our infant stages, maybe beginning of toddler stages. We've been in function about 4 years, and they're adding new disciplines as we go. Now, I think we're perfect for where we are, but is a toddler perfect in everything that it does? No, it's not. And so I think that when we look at holiness, frequently it's set apart. We're committed. God calls us to be holy or set apart for his purpose, not for our purpose. And so there is a completeness, a perfection, but I really get hesitant with perfection because our concept of perfection is something radically different than what it was in biblical times. Perfection then just meant to be good with where you were at that point in time. It didn't mean total, complete perfection. In our world, when we think of perfection, there is no error in any manner, shape, or form with something to be perfect. And so I think that God calls us to be perfect where we are in the process. And much like the team I lead at the hospital, I think we're perfect for where we are. Now, are there areas for improvement? Absolutely. There's so many more things that we can do, and we will do as we get the different disciplines and their knowledge ramps up. We will add these things, and we will be a better team or a more complete team. But we're set apart for a purpose as a team, and that's what God calls us to be here, set apart. When we look at the Jewish worship and compare it to the nations around them, their worship, a lot of them were sacrificing kids, having illicit, immoral relationships with the priestesses and stuff like that in their worship. And God's worship with the Israelites was totally different or totally set apart. And I think that's what he's calling us to here. We want to worship the Lord in beauty of holiness. And so there's a beauty to our holiness, or there's a distinctness to our set apartness.
I was listening to, may have been Ty Gibson, but somebody, it was talking about what true worship really is. And true worship is about thanksgiving. It's about being thankful to God. And he talked about the lepers, the 10 that were healed, and the one came back praising in thanksgiving, fell down and worshiped. So then, you go in anywhere it talks about worship and you think, it's from a thankful heart. It's thanksgiving. And that's all worship is praising God in thankfulness. And that changes the idea of an offering. Of course, false worship and false idols had offerings too. But they brought their offerings in order to get their God to do something for them in the future. We're supposed to be bringing offerings and thanksgiving for something he's already done for us in the past. There's a huge difference in bringing an offering, trying to appease somebody for a future benefit, or being thankful for a free gift that was already done for you.
Sure. And if you look at Exodus 20, where the 10 Commandments are, we frequently say the first commandment is, which one is it? Is there no other gods before thee? I'm forgetting. But anyway, the beginning of that is, I am the Lord thy God that brought thee out of Egypt. You know what I mean? The quotes for the first commandment starts there. And so I think your point is well made.
And they were this was at a point that they were still in major celebration for being freed.
Right. Yeah, verse 2 says, I am the Lord thy God, which hath brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And so his point is, that's why when we're looking at 1 Chronicles 16:20, give to the Lord the glory due his name. Well, he's due our glory because, one, he's the creator. Two, he's our recreator, and he's our salvation, And so, well, let's get through Sunday real quick, and we'll get on into some more meat. The second paragraph on Sunday says, today, of course, although the innate need to worship still exists in us, it is like everything else in the world. It has been twisted and distorted by sin, which means that, among other things, we as worshiping beings can end up worshiping the wrong things, or even end up not worshiping the Lord in the way he was supposed to be worshiped. And when we go to Monday, at the bottom of this is talking about we're all worshiping something. I love this quote by David Foster Wallace. It says, if you worship the wrong thing, it will eat you alive. And so when we're looking at, David Ashricks has a little thing he does, an exercise he does all the time, and is there good news that there's a God? It depends. It depends on the type of God, right? And so is there good news that there is the God in heaven? Absolutely. Was there good news that Nebuchadnezzar built a God for the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to worship? It wasn't, because he said if you don't worship him, you're going to die, right? And so we have a lot of gods in our world, and they're not good news. It depends on the character of the God as to whether it's good news that there's a God. And so when we have a God that is willing to sacrifice himself for us, that's good news. You know what I mean? He's so willing to put himself out to save us that he's gone through extreme lengths, and that is good news. And so that's what he's saying here. Worship, if it's to the wrong God, is not good worship. It will eat you alive. And so what's examples of that? I see in the healthcare constantly folks that are worshiping a substance. It could be alcohol or a drug or whatever. It's eating them alive. It's taking their life slowly from them, sometimes rapidly, but frequently slowly over time. It's no different than if our gods are the food signs that are lighted up. If we have to go here and have this and that, eventually we're going to have lots of health issues, and those gods will kill us as well. But we have all these different things that we worship. And so, back in the olden days, they had statues of fish, multi-headed gods, and all these other deities. A lot of the kings were gods. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, it says right here on Sunday, it says whatever we love the most, whatever we focus most of our attention on, whatever we live for, that is what we worship. Does anybody have any comments about that? Because it's interesting what it says up above that. It says some people worship money, power, sex, rock stars, actors, whatever.
Well, I think that it becomes radically important what we worship and how we worship it and why we're worshiping it. And so I don't disagree with Rob that, worship is thankfulness, but I have been in situations where I'm thankful I got a new 12-pack. You know what I mean? That's not the appropriate worship. So I think when we go through here, we can see that there's two components to worship. One is thankfulness, absolutely, but there's also truth. Yes, ma'am. Agreed. Right. So that's why I think that the end of Saturdays was huge, is because we have an innate desire to worship. It's built within us. And so we're going to all worship something. It's whether we're worshiping the right something in the right manner.
That's exactly the theme of Revelation, that when worship is forced upon the world, there'll be two basic groups that follow it. One that believe it and do it consciously, and the other one that just go along with it because it brings peace to their lives in some form, but they don't necessarily agree with it.
They're jumping through the hoops.
Or they don't realize they're doing it. One way or the other, they're just going along with the flow. Right.
It's the easiest. It's the path of least resistance.
Exactly.
Yep. Sorry.
And I mean, we don't know the ratios. We don't know the ratios that's going to be. It could be large groups of people that just go along with it that may feel like they're not worshiping, but in essence they are, just because they've rejected God.
But I think we can all agree that we are wired to worship. I don't remember which pastor it was. Is it Halverson that says we have a God-sized hole in our heart, and that's the only thing that will satisfy it. And so you can see that across all societies, against all populations of people in any nation. They have a desire to worship. It just depends on, they may ascribe that worship to the wrong thing, whether they believe it, whether they realize it, whether they are aware of it. And so that makes the education around worship remarkably important, especially when you look at Revelation. And in our end time, God's calling us to worship all, that follow all his commandments.
Well, I mean, in the first commandments, the word worship is synonymous with love. Love the Lord your God with all your mind, heart, and soul. So worship really is a form of love that is not human-centric. It's not the last six. It's the centric link between us and our Creator. But it is an expression of love is all it is.
Absolutely.
And he absolutely wired us, if God is love, to be loving creatures. Every created thing he made was wired to love.
Yes.
And therefore, because of that, you're absolutely right that worship is just an expression of love towards someone greater than ourselves.
But our filters of this world can say, but I love rock and roll. I love this. And so we have to figure out the balance of exactly what is the appropriate worship.
Well, and of course, that is where we are violating those first, commandments where we no longer are loving the Lord thy God with all our heart when we're putting something else ahead of him.
Yes. Let's go to Daniel 3, and we're going to go down to, if I can find the right verse. Looks like it's going to be let's start at verse 12. And we know that this is Nebuchadnezzar had the dream of the image. God gave Daniel the interpretation of the dream, and he was able to articulate it back to Nebuchadnezzar. But God was showing Nebuchadnezzar the different kingdoms and the progression of history after Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was kind of rebelling against God's vision and saying, my kingdom's going to last forever. You're wrong, God. And so I'm building me an idol of total gold. And so he had this gold and idol, and it was huge. And his commandment here was, you worship, bow down and worship, or die. Like, you're going to get thrown into the fiery furnace if you don't worship. And so in verse 12, these are some of the Chaldeans that came to Nebuchadnezzar, and they are saying, there are certain Jews whom thou hast appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then when they brought these men before the king, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said unto them, is it of purpose? I want you to put that in your file. Is it of purpose, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that ye serve not my God, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now if ye be ready, in case you didn't realize, I'm going to do this again, is what he's saying basically. That at the time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if ye worship not, ye shall be cast in the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer thee this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So was there a cost to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's decision?
There was a definite risk.
A risk of them losing their life. By human eyes, it looked like they were going to die. Yet they still chose to worship God. And so I don't think frequently we get in a church service and people get up to sing and they say, we're going to go to God and worship now. Singing is one variety of worship, which is more of like an emotional worship. It brings us close to God. It definitely does. But I think what God is calling us to worship him in is in truth and in emotion or spirit. And so We'll get into that deeper as we go. But with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, by all human concept, there was a cost. They were having to say, I'm going to choose to follow God at the chance of my death. Now, was there a cost for them earlier when they first came to Nebuchadnezzar's court? They chose to not eat of the king's meat and the different things. Did they stand out? Did it set them apart from the rest of their peers? It did. It set them apart. They chose to do something that they made a conscious choice, and God supported that choice and honored it. But they had to make the choice, which, there were risks there. But they kept risking the right way in following God's commands, and he kept supporting them. Now, I have one of my favorite little pastors that says here he wonders if they didn't already see God walking in the fire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I'll tell you they didn't at this point, because they're saying, even if he doesn't, O king, we're still going to worship.
Well,
even if he doesn't save us. We know he can, but even if he doesn't, we're not going to worship your God.
But you notice they're not the ones that brought up God.
Right.
Nebuchadnezzar did.
I
Who
know.
is this God that shall deliver you? He's basically saying, who's greater than I am?
Absolutely.
But he knew the answer because he knew them.
Yes.
They were not strangers to him in his court. They were actually pretty high up. And
well, that's why they said the guys thou appointed. You know what I mean? So, yeah, he was definitely known, and their God was known to him. I think that's part of his anxiety at giving them a second option, okay? He didn't want their God, or our God, to display his power, and yet his emotion and his anger trumped his intellect, and he still, after they deferred worshiping his God, that he chose to throw them in the furnace. Yes, sir.
Well, back to what you were saying and what he mentioned, that, where's your God that will deliver you from me? And so he knew something was up, and that's why he said for the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter. Thought, I'm going to win this,
yes.
Even though, well,
this is a competition that who's the strongest. I'm going to show I'm the strongest.
Well, and of course,
now,
of course, when it happened, he's looking in there to see if something's happening. Mm-hmm. Of course, any normal human would think they're gone, they're toast. Right. There's no point in looking.
Right.
He
was anxious.
He's
about
intently looking to make sure something, doesn't
yes.
go awry for him, and of course it did. But his response to it was also something where God's name was glorified.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, there's no mention
well, that's
of that.
The other
There's no
component.
mention of that idol ever again, because I think it lost all its importance.
So was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trying to stand apart for their own glory? No, it was to glorify God. And so that's another important aspect of true worship. One, there's a risk, I think, an apparent risk. And like you said, Robert, in the end, they were blessed way more than the risk that they took, right? But there's still an apparent, to human eyes, there's a risk to worship.
But I think the important thing is, of course, they didn't just come to this point randomly. We show story after story after
mm-hmm.
story that led up to this, where God was working in their lives in ways where he was personally touching them.
Right.
And
so
they built a trust and relationship with him where they said, we know he
mm-hmm.
can. There was no doubt that he could do it. They knew mm-hmm. that for a fact. But then, without expressing doubt, they said, but if not, we still will not violate that relationship and bow down to your idol.
So what were they perfect in?
Trust.
Their faith was their faith in God's faithfulness was perfect.
What it is, they knew him
mm-hmm.
and they knew what he wanted,
right.
but they also knew that there was an enemy in conflict with God, and sometimes humans had to suffer
right.
in that battle. They knew this.
Yes.
And therefore, they had perfect faith in God's love, but
right.
they knew there still may be
whether he saved them or let them
may
suffer.
There mm-hmm. may be consequences
yes.
even in that perfect
yes.
faith.
Yes, absolutely. So, what what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did say, and why I said, is it of a purpose to put that in your file, they were very purposeful with their worship, right? They were purposeful in not following the king's command. And so I think that we have to, like when it talks about their nutrition and the diet they chose, they purposed in their heart, is what it says, not to eat the king's meat and not to eat. So I think there's a great deal that we have to do when we're saying they were perfect in their faith of his faithfulness to them. They were perfect in that. Now, other things in their life may not have been perfect, but they were perfect in trusting God. You know what I mean? And so that's the part that I think we can hope for here in this world. We will never be perfect in this earth until we're changed at the twinkling of an eye. But God can help us perfect our trust in him to the point that we're perfect in trusting him. Let's go to read Revelations 14, 6 through 12. Would somebody read that? Revelation 14, 6 through 12.
While you're getting that, I wanted to make one last point on this. They were very humble in their response to him. They weren't standing on the front row out of all these thousands of people trying to make a spectacle.
No.
They had to be brought before him and told what they did. So it would seem like they were trying to, I wouldn't say hide from it, but they're trying to be respectful of the king as much as possible without violating God's law.
Yeah, they weren't trying to throw it in his face. They weren't grabbing attention for them. They weren't.
I think they were trying to be in the shadows as much as possible in order to not, because, They weren't trying to do anything to bring any disrespect to anyone else purposely.
But who brought attention to them?
Oh, all those that were watching that basically hated them for their faith.
Satan. Satan brought attention to them, okay?
Yes.
So he wanted this conflict. He's the one that stimulated the change, so when you look at the pride of Nebuchadnezzar to make the gold image totally gold, that's a Satan-inspired thought, okay? Now, I'm not saying that Satan was there manipulating Nebuchadnezzar totally, but he obviously had his pride under his control and a lot of his aspects of his character. What is different with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their character, their will, their purpose was submitted to God. And so that's why they were humble in their response. That's why they were confident in their risk-taking. And let's go to Revelation 14. Who has that? 6 through 12. Sure, read away.
And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. And there followed another angel, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, If any man worship the beast in his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascended up forever and ever. And they have no rest day nor night who worship the beast in his image, and whosoever receiveth the mark of his name. Here's the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Was it through 12?
That's 14? Good enough. 12, good enough. So this is the three angels' messages, which are, the purpose of our church to a great degree, are to be involved with these three messages going to the world. there's a project management or Lean Six Sigma. When you do a project in the business world, they talk to you about scope and picking a scope that's narrow and defined and what can be achieved and setting achievable goals. God's call here is to the whole world, and so that's a pretty broad scope. He also alludes to the fact that in verse 7, fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made heaven, earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. And so why should we worship him? Because he's our creator, and by extension, Ellen G. White says the same creative power that God possesses is the same powers used to recreate us. And so he's our creator initially, and then he's also our recreator. That's why he deserves our worship. And when we get to 12, it says, here are the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. So there's a great deal about worship. If we have the right type of worship, we will be commended as here are the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. And so there is a risk associated with bad worship, okay? So if we're not worshiping in spirit and in truth, we have a consequence for that. Yes, sir.
Let me read this paragraph I just happened across last week. It's called The Signpost Turned Around. It says, the Lord has clearly defined the road to the city of God, but the great apostate has changed the signpost, setting up a false one, a spurious Sabbath. He says, I will work at cross purposes with God. I will empower my delegate, the man of sin, to take down God's memorial, the seventh-day Sabbath. Thus I will show the world that the day sanctified and blessed by God has been changed. That day shall not live in the minds of the people. I will obliterate the memory of it. I will place in its stead a day bearing not the credentials of heaven, a day that cannot be a sign between God and his people. I will lead the people to accept this day, to place upon the sanctity that God placed upon the seventh day. Through my vicegerent I will exalt myself. The first day shall be extolled, and the Protestant world shall receive this spurious Sabbath as genuine. Through the non-observance of the Sabbath God instituted, I will bring his law into contempt. The words, a signpost between me and you through our generations, I will make to serve on the side of my Sabbath. Thus the world will become mine. I will be ruler of the earth, prince of the world. I will be so control the minds under the power of God's Sabbath shall be an object of contempt. A sign I will make the observance of the seventh day, a sign of disloyalty to the authorities of the earth. Human laws shall be made so stringent that men and women will not dare to observe the seventh-day Sabbath for fear of wanting food and clothing. They will join with the world in transgressing God's law, and the earth will be wholly under my dominion.
And so that's why I think it's important that we understand that there can be a risk to us. There's a sacrifice that comes before worship frequently. Let's read 2 Samuel 24, and I'm going to get to the right spot. I think it's 16. And so in 2 Samuel 24, this is where David, it says God moved upon him to count the Israelites. They were counted. I think it was Joab stood up and said, don't do this sin. And David persisted. Yeah, Joab. And so after 9 months plus, they come back with a number, and then here's the number of the warriors anyway, and then there's a plague that is poured out on Israel, and 70,000 people died. And so I'm picking up there in 16, and when the angel stretched out his hand upon Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord repented him of the evil and said to the angel that destroyed the people, it is enough. Stay now thy hand. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing place of Araunah the Jebusite. And David spake unto the Lord when he saw the angel that smote the people, and said, Lo, I have sinned, I have done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Referring to the Israelites. Let thy hand, I pray thee, be against me and against my father's house. And Gad, a prophet, came that day to David and said unto him, Go up, rear an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Now, did he say to purchase it, or did he say to rear an altar? Go up, rear an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So I want you to, here's God's command to David is, I want an altar done here. 19 says, and David, according to the saying of Gad, went up as the Lord commanded. And Araunah looked and saw the king and his servants coming up toward him. And Araunah went out, bowed himself down before the king on his face upon the ground. And Araunah said, wherefore is my lord the king come to his servant? And David said, to buy the threshing floor of thee, to build an altar unto the Lord, that the plague may be stayed from the people. Now David said he's going to buy the threshing floor. God just said to build an altar there, or rear an altar. And Araunah said unto David, let thy lord the king take and offer what seemeth good unto him. Behold, here be oxen for burnt sacrifice, and the threshing instruments, and the other instruments of the oxen for wood. All these things did Araunah as the king, and all these things did Araunah as a king give unto the king. And Araunah said unto the king, the Lord thy God accept thee. And the king said unto Araunah, nay, but I will surely buy it of thee at a price. Neither will I offer burnt offerings unto the Lord my God, which doth cost me nothing. And so I think this principle is pretty foundational to true worship. There is a cost associated with worship. God didn't tell David to go buy things. He just told him to rear an altar. But David knows that when we look back at God, when Christ came down and made his original covenant with Abraham, they slew the animals and split them in half, and then Christ walked between the animals counting the cost. His ultimate worship to God was to give himself on the cross for us, and there was a cost associated with it. And Ellen G. White says when he's walking between the animals, he's counting the cost. But he found it acceptable because, as Robert was saying, there's a benefit on the other side of the risk of worship that outweighed the cost to him of that worship. Yes, sir.
You're absolutely right. But see, the other side, Cain did the same thing, but he focused on the cost, and he brought the wrong offering. He brought the offering he thought cost him the most because that's what he did. He was a farmer.
Sure.
But by doing that, he substituted what God's command was that pointed towards Christ and brought an offering that was unacceptable.
Right. But I think the important thing is here that we understand about worship, there is a cost associated with true worship. And if we're elevating God and not ourselves, that's an evidence of true worship. So when we go to Monday, let's go to Psalm 78, 1 to 17. And we're going to live here for just a moment. Psalm 78.
I think also you're right there, but I think of the widow putting the coin in the thing, and we're told hers
she gave
was greater.
Her total.
She gave her all, but that's where the difference lies. She didn't. It was a huge cost because it was her last, but she didn't count the cost.
No.
She did. It was not important to her compared to what God had done for her.
Well, she didn't. She probably counted the cost, but she didn't see it as too costly to give everything for God.
That's kind of what I mean.
Know what I mean?
It was. It was worth it.
Yes, for her
completely in her heart for what he had done.
And Christ recognized her sacrifice and applauded it. You know what I mean? Even though it was a small amount.
Take it a step further. There is a cost, but when we look at it and we give our offerings, we realize what we give is not enough.
Absolutely.
It can never be enough, and that's the difference. Because even though it is costly to us, it is so pale in comparison to what he's done. That out of our hearts, there can never be an offering that covers it.
We can never supersede his sacrifice, right? I mean, his sacrifice was the ultimate sacrifice for us.
Whereas the other side, like Cain and the false offerings, they try to calculate what is the most I have to give in order to get the blessing I'm looking
Right.
for.
Well, it's who's my neighbor, so I can exclude those that aren't. You know what I mean? And so that's an underlying principle. So when we go to Psalms, this is where Asaph is one of David's psalters or singers or poem writers, and he was pretty instrumental. You'll see him here across the Psalms. I think he wrote 7 or 8. You'll see him pop in and out routinely in the Bible of that era. And so basically this is a call to Israel's rich history. And so verse 7 is instrumental. This is talking about how that they should worship God, how they should educate their children about worship, and how they should prepare them for oncoming generations. And so I'm going to start at verse 2. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old. Now, dark here, our lesson points out, just means it's not that they're bad sayings, it's they're kind of forgotten or faded memories of sayings, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from our children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he hath done. For he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers that they should make them known to their children. And the reason he wants them to make them known to their children is in verse 6, that the generations to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. And so he's wanting to perpetuate this education through the generations, that they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. And so, again, I think this is the true worship leads us to set our hope in God and to make sure that we share that with others. And so we will not forget God. Ellen G. White's famous quote is, the only thing to fear about the future is that we forget how God led us in the past, right? And so that's what they're trying to do here, is to perpetuate the memory of God's good works and his righteousness through the generations. Verse 8 says, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God. And so that's the point that we can see in Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had faith in himself and know God. He was God, and he wanted them to worship him as God, and what God can save you is what he told Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego purposed to worship God, the true God that's in heaven, and they took some humanly apparent risks in doing that multiple times. And so when we get to there on the plain where they're supposed to worship and they get thrown in the fiery furnace, what did they get in the fire? They got a close walk with God. You know what I mean? And so frequently we fear the fire. We fear tribulation, but I think it draws us closer to God. In healthcare, there's a root cause analysis. I used to be over ICU at Floyd, and we would always have to do a root cause analysis on why something happened that should have never happened. And we had to go in front of legal and risk and administration and expound, here's what happened in our department. We'll never have it happen again if we can help it, kind of thing. And here's our steps to prevent it. But my director and I, we were always nervous about that because you're getting scrutinized as a leader, and your people are getting scrutinized. And so I would always talk to Lee, who is my director, and I said, Lee, we're going into the fire, but the only thing that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego lost in the fire was the ropes that tied them. That's the only thing they lost. And so we frequently don't want tribulation or don't want scrutiny from God, but he can purify us in those fires, just like he did with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He can burn off the ropes that are tying us. He can get rid of the filters that are keeping us from seeing the God that really is there in front of us. But our earthly filters are keeping us from seeing it and recognizing it.
Look where that ended up. I mean, this is arguably one of the most spectacular manifestations of God in all of the Bible.
Yes.
And it changed all of Babylon instantly.
Right.
And pretty much the story changed the world ever since.
Well, and Nebuchadnezzar eventually came to God and actually wrote a chapter in the Bible. I think it's Daniel chapter 4 was attributed to him.
Well, I mean, looking at the perspective of this story, some of the information on it almost had to have come from him too, because of
right.
Who else would have known?
Right. He wouldn't have known that perspective, yeah. So let's go to John. We got to get to Tuesday. I'm really getting bogged down here, sorry. I'm not making it as far as I need to be making it. John 4, 7 to 26. We're not going to read it all, but this is where Jesus and the disciples were on a missionary journey, so to speak. They stopped at a well, and the disciples went to obtain food, and Christ stayed and talked to a Samaritan woman, which in and of itself shocked the woman at the beginning of the interaction. Why are you talking to me when I'm a Samaritan, basically? She was shocked. And then it says when the disciples came back, they were amazed that he spoke with her. And so just the interaction itself was amazing. But in the end, there's a lot to glean from here. And I'm trying to find the specific verse. Oh, that's my problem. I'm in chapter 7, sorry. Okay, verse 23. But the hour cometh, and now is, when true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. 24 says, God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And so this is a remarkable amount of depth or insight into true worship that God reveals in this interaction between Christ and the woman. And so we've talked some about spirit and truth, but not much in depth. And so underneath this in the lesson on Tuesday, it says, though the woman tried to change the subject by talking about worship, Jesus used her tactic to give us some profound truths about worship and what worship involves. Perhaps most important for our immediate purposes is that he said in 4:24, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. And I really like the way they broke it down here. It says, true worship of the Lord must be in spirit, that is, must stem from love of God, from the experience of knowing him personally. And so I think those are one aspect of it. It's like the Ten Commandments. You have 2 tablets, right? And so if you imagine 2 tablets for worship, here's one aspect of the worship is that we have to have love of God, and from the experience of knowing him is where the worship must stem from. The religion, this is a remarkably powerful quote from Ellen G. White, it says, the religion that comes from God is the only religion that will lead to God. In order to serve him right, we must be born of the divine Spirit. This will purify the heart, renew the mind, and give us a new capacity for knowing and loving God. It will give us a willing obedience to all his requirements. This is true worship. It is the fruit of the working of the Holy Spirit. And so with Nebuchadnezzar, I'm going to keep going back to this, I guess. We see him as being rebellious against God's vision to him because he said, no, my kingdom's not going to end here in a little bit. I'm keeping my kingdom forever. The whole image is going to be gold. But yet, after he's had his interaction with God and his pride and self-interested things are out of the way, when you read Daniel 4, he's a changed individual. And so the Spirit has changed him. And so at the same time, worship must be in truth. So we have one aspect is knowing him personally and springing from love of God. And then the other aspect is the experience that comes from knowing and obeying God and the objective truths revealed to us about God. So there has to be the truth aspect. Spirit without truth can lead to a shallow sentimentalism that's built more on fickle emotion than on anything else. In contrast, truth without spirit can lead to a lifeless formalism. And so this is the balance that God's calling us to in spirit and truth. It can't be too far to one side, it can't be too far to the other side, because it has different aspects that it leads to.
Well, I like the woman's response to that. She responded to the idea of truth. But, I mean, she doesn't understand the spirit worship yet.
Right.
But she understood the idea of truth, because she basically said flat out, the Christ, the Messiah, is coming and will declare all things. He is the truth.
Yeah.
And he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Right.
She recognized and was looking for the truth in the coming Messiah.
Right.
And he said, that's me.
And she accepted it, right? Even though he'd said it's me to the Israelites repeatedly throughout his ministry, or the Jews, and they mostly, especially the leaders of the Jewish nation, rejected him, generally speaking. But, yeah, she accepted it. And even...
Well, he gave evidence of it, that through the conversation leading up to that.
Sure.
Therefore, when he declared it, the evidence backed up what he said.
Yes. 1 Chronicles 13, 6 through 14 is probably going to be the last thing we're going to be able to hit on. Sorry, I'm not progressing as fast as I would like. 1 Chronicles 13. So this, in our lesson, is talking about 1 Chronicles 16, but I want to bring it to you that David was initially going to bring the ark from Kirjath-Jearim in 13. And so David talked to the people in the congregation, and if it seems good to you that it be of the Lord our God, let us send abroad unto our brethren everywhere that are left in all the land of Israel, and with them also to the priests and Levites which are in the cities and suburbs, that they may gather themselves unto us, and let us bring again the ark of our God unto us, for we inquired not at it in the days of Saul. In other words, it got taken from the Israelites in the days of Saul. David is now in the king role, and he's saying, people, I would like to bring the ark to our city. So David gathered this is verse 5, so David gathered all Israel together from Shiloh to Egypt, even unto the entering of Hermon, to bring the ark of God from Kirjath-Jearim. And David went up, and all Israel, to Baalah, which is Kirjath-Jearim, which belonged to Judah, to bring up thence the ark of God, the Lord, that dwelleth between the cherubim, whose name is called on it. And they carried the ark of God in a new cart out of the house of Abinadab, and Uzzah and Ohio drave the cart. And they cheered and praised God and worshiped God with lots of music and emotion as they were doing this. And in verse 10 it says, or 9, and then they came unto the threshing floor of Chidon. Uzzah put forth his hand to hold the ark, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and he smote him, because he put his hand on the ark, and there he died before God. And David was displeased, because the Lord had made a breach upon Uzzah. Wherefore that place is called Perez Uzzah. And so basically, David was bringing forth the ark, and he had a lot of emotion and praise and spirit worship, but he wasn't doing it in truth. He wasn't bringing the ark as God had commanded them to carry an ark. I think his intent, his motive was good, but he was not understanding truth. When we get over to 16, you can see that he understands. And so there's a lot of details here, and it is a beautiful chapter to read about because he went into such intimate detail on worshiping God and how he went above and beyond. And so,
Tim, I think one thing, just like the serpent on the pole, they started worshiping it. I even think us today, God hid the ark in the temple behind a veil for a reason. I mean, I think if it was to sit here today, open, even the way we know it, it would start to become very difficult to not cross that line of worshiping the object versus worshiping God.
yes,
I mean, we're not any more immune from that than they were. I mean, we might show reverence to it, and that's how it starts, but I think very easily people see things like that. And the ark is a great thing that God created.
right,
And it's very easy to take that line and step away from worshiping God to the creation.
right. But still, they didn't worship it in truth. And so in 15:13, 1 Chronicles 15:13, it says, this is David speaking, "For because ye did it not at the first, the Lord our God made a breach upon us, for that we sought him not after the due order." And so there is a proper worship. And so David's acknowledging that he did not do the proper order on the first worship. And then in 16, you see where they did the proper order. The ark was carried on the shoulders of the priests as it was commanded to be done, and they didn't have any untoward relationships with God or breaches with God after that. And so I think that's a huge component for us when we look at Revelation. We don't want breaches with God. We don't want severed relationship with him or with each other. And so if we follow worship in spirit and truth, we are ultimately faithful in his faithfulness to us. Then when we get to Revelation, we can be one that says that God says there's the patience of the saints. And so that's our call to true worship. And when you look at the beauty of holiness, this is talking about 16, how God honored David and Israelites' proper worship in bringing the ark back to Jerusalem. To worship and to worship education must be Jesus and the plan of salvation, all of which was foreshadowed in the tabernacle service. Whatever else God has done for us that deserves praise and worship, it means nothing without the hope of eternal life offered to us by his sacrificial and substitutionary death on the cross. And so when we're looking in Revelation 14, it's talking about the eternal gospel. Well, that is the eternal gospel. Christ gave his life for us so that we would have a shot at being able to go to heaven if we purpose, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do, on our worship and the type of worship we will have. All right, it is time for us to close. John, would you mind having closing prayer for us, please, sir?
Our Heavenly Father, we are grateful for the opportunity to come here and study your word, and I pray that you continue to help us to contemplate these things we have read and to learn how to truly worship you and to put you first in our lives, and give us wisdom to know if that is what we are doing, because we know that if we are allowed to live to see you return, that we will be tested in similar ways that Daniel and Shadrach and these others were tested. And so we just ask and pray and trust that you will strengthen us and help us remain faithful to you, that we would honor and glorify your name. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.